You can learn exactly what people think of you by looking at where they ask you to sit. That was the lesson I learned on my mother-in-law's 67th birthday. My name is Emily Carter, and for nearly 10 years I had been part of the Whitmore family without ever truly feeling accepted by them. The Whitmores were one of the wealthiest families in our county. They owned farmland, commercial properties, and a successful investment company that had been growing for generations. Their family gatherings looked like something from a magazine. Luxury cars filled the driveway. Expensive clothes seemed to be a requirement. Conversations revolved around business deals, vacation homes, and private schools. Then there was me. I grew up in a small apartment above a hardware store. My father repaired air conditioners. My mother worked long hours at a grocery store. We never had much money, but we always had enough. When I married their son Daniel, I believed that kindness and hard work would eventually earn respect. 10 years later, I was still waiting. The birthday celebration was held at the Whitmore estate, a massive property overlooking a lake. More than 50 relatives and family friends attended. As soon as Daniel and I arrived, I noticed the familiar looks. Some were polite, others were not. A few people smiled at me while somehow making it clear they did not consider me one of them. I had learned to ignore it. At least I thought I had. Inside the ballroom, staff members moved between tables making final preparations for dinner. Each place setting displayed a name card. I searched for mine while Daniel greeted relatives. The main family table stood at the center of the room beneath an enormous chandelier. Every immediate family member had a seat there. Every family member except me. My card sat at a small table near the back of the room beside distant acquaintances and business guests. For a moment, I simply stared at it. It was not the first time something like this had happened. Birthdays, holidays, charity events. Somehow there was always a reason why I ended up somewhere else. Before I could say anything, I heard a voice behind me. Well, at least they found a place for you. Several people laughed softly. I turned and saw one of Margaret's nieces holding a glass of sparkling water. Her smile looked friendly, but her words were not. I suppose the main table is getting crowded these days, she added. More laughter followed. I forced a smile. I am sure everyone will fit just fine. She shrugged. Not everyone belongs at every table. The conversation moved on, but the words stayed with me. Moments later, Daniel found me. He immediately noticed the seating arrangement. This is ridiculous, he said quietly. I will talk to someone. I touched his arm. Please do not. I was tired of creating scenes. Tired of being the reason people whispered. It was easier to pretend it did not matter. Across the room, I noticed Margaret Whitmore watching. My mother-in-law rarely missed anything. She stood near a group of guests listening to a conversation, yet her eyes briefly met mine. There was something unusual in her expression. Not pity, not surprise, almost concern. The evening continued. Speeches were given. Gifts were presented. Family members praised Margaret's accomplishments and generosity. I helped serve desserts when the staff became overwhelmed. I refilled drinks. I checked on elderly guests. Nobody asked me to. I simply saw things that needed to be done. As the night went on, I noticed Margaret watching me more than once. Near the end of the celebration, after most guests had settled into conversations, she quietly approached my table. The room remained busy enough that nobody paid attention. She placed a hand gently on my shoulder and leaned closer. Emily, she said softly, one day the truth about people becomes impossible to ignore. Before I could ask what she meant, someone called her name from across the room. Margaret smiled faintly and walked away. I sat there confused, watching her disappear into the crowd. At the time, I assumed she was simply being kind. I had no idea those words would become the beginning of everything that followed. The days following Margaret's birthday party passed much like the years before it. Life moved forward, but the memory of her strange comment remained in the back of my mind. I told myself I was reading too much into it. After all, Margaret had always been difficult to understand. She was not openly affectionate, yet she was not cruel. She rarely shared her thoughts, and when she did, her words often carried meanings that only became clear much later. A week after the celebration, I stopped by her house to deliver homemade soup. She had mentioned feeling tired during the party, and although nobody asked me to check on her, it felt like the right thing to do. When I arrived, the large estate seemed unusually quiet. Most members of the family only visited when there was a holiday, a celebration, or some business matter to discuss. I let myself in through the kitchen entrance, something Margaret had allowed me to do years earlier. I found her sitting alone on the back patio overlooking the lake. The autumn breeze moved gently through the trees as she stared across the water. "You should have called," I said as I set the container on the table. "I could have brought lunch too." Margaret smiled faintly. "You always bring more than anyone asks for." I laughed softly. "That sounds like a complaint." "It is not." She looked out toward the lake again. "It is an observation." I sat beside her, and for several minutes we simply talked about ordinary things. The weather, the changing leaves, a neighbor who had recently moved away. It was surprisingly peaceful. Then her expression grew serious. "Do you ever regret marrying into this family?" The question caught me completely off guard. I hesitated before answering. "No," I said honestly. "I regret some experiences. Not the marriage." She nodded slowly. "Even after everything?" I knew what she meant. The comments, the exclusion, the subtle reminders that I came from a different background. People usually reveal more about themselves than they do about me, I said. Margaret looked at me carefully. "That is an unusual way to see it." "It helps." She smiled again, but this time there was sadness behind it. Later that afternoon, I helped her organize a few rooms inside the house. While sorting through old family photographs, I noticed something that surprised me. There were dozens of framed pictures, featuring nearly every member of the Whitmore family. Children, grandchildren, cousins, spouses. Yet very few photographs included Margaret herself. "You are missing from most of these," I said. She glanced at the wall. "People usually prefer being remembered for what they leave behind." At the time, I thought she was simply being reflective. Looking back now, I realized she was telling me much more. Over the next several months, Margaret's health began changing. Nothing dramatic at first. She tired more easily. She canceled social events. She spent less time managing family affairs. As word spread, relatives who rarely visited suddenly started appearing more often. Expensive gift baskets arrived. Invitations appeared. Phone calls became frequent. Everyone seemed eager to demonstrate concern. I tried not to judge anyone's motives. Perhaps they genuinely cared. Still, the timing was difficult to ignore. Through all of it, I continued helping when I could. Grocery shopping, medical appointments, household tasks, small things that needed doing. I never considered them sacrifices. They were simply part of caring for someone. One evening, after returning from a doctor's appointment, Margaret remained unusually quiet during the drive home. As we pulled into her driveway, she turned toward me. Her eyes carried a seriousness I had never seen before. "Emily," she said softly, "there will come a day when people finally understand what matters." Before I could respond, she reached over and squeezed my hand. Then she stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the house, leaving me alone with a growing feeling that something important was approaching, even though I had no idea what it would be. Winter arrived quietly that year. The trees surrounding the Whitmore estate lost their leaves, and the lake behind the house often looked gray beneath the cloudy sky. As the months passed, Margaret's health continued to decline. She remained independent in many ways, but the strong, energetic woman everyone had known for decades seemed to be slowly withdrawing from the world around her. What surprised me most was how differently people behaved once they realized her condition was becoming serious. Relatives who had barely visited in years suddenly became regular guests. Some arrived carrying flowers. Others brought expensive gifts. Family dinners appeared on the calendar almost every weekend. At first, I wanted to believe everyone was simply trying to make the most of their remaining time with her. But the conversations told a different story. More and more often, discussions drifted toward family assets, property values, business holdings, and future plans. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and overheard two relatives debating which parcel of land would likely be sold after Margaret was gone. Neither of them noticed me standing nearby. The conversation ended only when Margaret entered the room. The uncomfortable silence that followed revealed more than their words ever could. Through all of this, Margaret rarely commented. She listened. She observed. She remembered. I could see it in her eyes. Nothing escaped her attention. One evening, after helping organize paperwork in her home office, I found her staring at an old photograph. The picture showed her and her late husband standing beside a small farmhouse many years earlier. They looked young and hopeful. Their clothes were simple. Their smiles were genuine. "That was before the success," she said quietly. "Before the businesses. Before the investments. Before everyone cared about what we owned." I sat beside her. "You look happy." She smiled softly. We had almost nothing. The irony lingered between us. The family now possessed enormous wealth, yet many relationships seemed more fragile than ever. A few weeks later, Margaret experienced a health scare that required a short hospital stay. The news spread quickly through the family. Suddenly, the waiting room filled with visitors. Some stayed for hours. Others stopped by briefly. I visited every day after work. Sometimes Margaret slept. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we simply sat together in comfortable silence. One rainy evening, after most visitors had left, she asked me to close the hospital room door. Her expression was serious. "Emily, there is something I want you to remember." I pulled my chair closer. "Of course." She looked toward the window for a moment before speaking. "People spend their lives believing that wealth reveals character. The truth is often the opposite. Wealth reveals what was already there." I thought about her words carefully. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "You will understand eventually." It felt like another one of her mysterious lessons. Yet this time, there was a weight behind it that unsettled me. Before I could ask more questions, a nurse entered the room, and the conversation ended. Margaret returned home a few days later. Physically, she seemed stable, but something had changed. She began organizing old documents. She met privately with attorneys and financial advisors. Several times, I arrived to help with household tasks and found legal folders spread across her dining room table. Whenever I offered assistance, she simply smiled and changed the subject. Then, late one afternoon, as snow began falling outside, she handed me a small envelope. My name was written on the front in her careful handwriting. "Do not open this now," she said. "Keep it somewhere safe." I looked at the envelope in confusion. "What is it?" Her eyes softened. "A promise." Before I could ask another question, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. In that moment, I felt an unexpected wave of emotion. I did not know why. I only knew that something important was happening beneath the surface of events, and somehow Margaret had already seen the future long before the rest of us. Spring arrived, but the atmosphere within the Whitmore family remained strangely tense. Margaret had returned home from the hospital months earlier, yet everyone seemed aware that time was becoming more precious. The family responded in very different ways. Some relatives became unusually attentive. Others appeared more interested in schedules, meetings, and conversations involving attorneys than in Margaret herself. I tried not to focus on it. My routine remained unchanged. I visited several times each week, helped around the house, and spent time with her whenever she wanted company. One Saturday afternoon, the entire family gathered at the estate for lunch. Officially, it was simply a family reunion. Unofficially, everyone seemed to believe something important was about to happen. The large dining room buzzed with conversation. Discussions drifted from investments to property values to speculation about future plans. Nobody spoke openly about inheritance, yet the subject seemed present in every conversation. As I carried a tray of drinks from the kitchen, I overheard one cousin explaining how the lakefront property alone was worth several $1,000,000. Another relative discussed the family investment portfolio. A third talked about possible ownership structures after Margaret was gone. Not one person mentioned Margaret's happiness, health, or wishes, only her assets. Across the room, Margaret sat quietly listening. Her expression revealed nothing. That afternoon, after lunch ended, she surprised everyone by asking the family to gather in the library. The room immediately filled with anticipation. Several relatives exchanged curious glances. Others sat forward expectantly. I remained near the back, assuming this conversation had little to do with me. Margaret looked around the room slowly before speaking. "I have spent most of my life building things," she said. "A family, businesses, opportunities, traditions." Everyone listened carefully. "What concerns me now is not what I leave behind. It is who people become while waiting to receive it." The statement created an uncomfortable silence. A few people laughed nervously. Others looked away. Then one of Margaret's sons asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. "Are you talking about your estate planning?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I am talking about character." The answer disappointed several people visibly. The conversation ended shortly afterward, but the tension remained. During the following weeks, something strange happened. Family members began competing for Margaret's attention in increasingly obvious ways. Expensive gifts appeared. Invitations arrived. Offers of assistance multiplied. Some efforts seemed sincere. Others felt carefully calculated. One evening, I stopped by to drop off groceries and found 3 different flower arrangements sitting on Margaret's kitchen counter. Attached cards displayed the names of relatives who rarely visited before her health problems began. Margaret noticed me looking at them. "Interesting timing, is it not?" she asked. I could not help smiling. "You noticed too?" She laughed softly. "Emily, I notice everything." Then her expression became thoughtful. "The difficult part is deciding what truly matters." Several days later, I arrived unexpectedly and found Margaret sitting alone in her study, surrounded by notebooks and documents. The envelope she had given me weeks earlier remained safely stored at home, unopened as she requested. She glanced up as I entered. "Good," she said. "I was hoping you would come." She pointed toward a chair across from her desk. Once I sat down, she opened a drawer and removed an old leather-bound journal. The cover showed years of wear. Its pages looked filled with handwritten notes. Margaret placed her hand gently on top of it. "There are things people never see," she said quietly. "Not because they are hidden, because they never bother to look." I stared at the journal. "What is it?" For a moment, she seemed ready to answer. Then the phone rang. The interruption broke the moment completely. Margaret closed the journal and returned it to the drawer. "Another day," she said. At the time, I felt disappointed. Looking back, I realized that was the first glimpse of a secret that would eventually change everything the Whitmore family believed about itself. The summer that followed felt strangely divided between appearances and reality. On the surface, the Whitmore family seemed more united than ever. Relatives visited frequently. Family dinners became common. Phone calls arrived daily. Yet beneath those gestures, I sensed a growing current of expectation that nobody openly acknowledged. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something. Margaret saw it too. One afternoon, I arrived at the estate carrying groceries and found her sitting alone in the library. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating shelves filled with books collected over decades. The old leather journal rested on the table beside her. This time, she did not hide it when I entered. Instead, she motioned for me to sit down. "I think it is time you saw something," she said quietly. My eyes immediately moved to the journal. Margaret opened it carefully and turned several pages before sliding it across the table. At first, I assumed it was a diary. It was not. Each page contained observations, dates, small moments, conversations, acts of kindness, acts of selfishness, family interactions recorded over many years. I looked up in surprise. "You wrote all of this?" She nodded. "For almost 15 years. I continued reading. Some entries described holidays. Others described hospital visits, birthdays, anniversaries, and family gatherings. What struck me most was what Margaret chose to record. She rarely mentioned gifts, achievements, or financial success. Instead, she focused on behavior. Who showed up when nobody was watching? Who helped without being asked? Who remembered important details? Who treated others with respect? The deeper I read, the more uncomfortable I felt. "Why did you keep this?" I asked. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Because people reveal their true character in small moments." She pointed toward one page. "Anyone can be generous when there is an audience." Then she pointed toward another. "Character appears when there is nothing to gain." Her words stayed with me long after I closed the journal. Before leaving that day, I noticed something unexpected. Dozens of entries mentioned me. Not because I had done anything extraordinary. Most involved ordinary situations. Bringing meals after a difficult week. Driving Margaret to appointments. Fixing a broken appliance. Staying late after family events to help clean. Small things I barely remembered. "You kept track of all this?" I asked. Margaret smiled gently. I paid attention. I felt embarrassed. None of those things were important. Her expression immediately changed. "That is where you are wrong, Emily." The seriousness in her voice caught me off guard. "Those things are exactly what matter." Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking constantly about the journal. Meanwhile, activity around the family continued increasing. Attorneys visited the estate. Several times, financial advisors came and went. Relatives seemed unusually interested in Margaret's schedule. More than once, I overheard conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. One evening, Daniel and I attended a family dinner at the estate. During dessert, one cousin casually asked Margaret whether she had finalized her estate plans. The room became silent almost instantly. Every person at the table seemed to stop breathing. Margaret calmly set down her fork. Yes, she answered. Several faces brightened. Then she added, a long time ago. The disappointment around the room was almost visible. Later that evening, after most guests had left, I helped Margaret clear dishes from the dining room. As we worked, she seemed unusually thoughtful. Finally, she stopped and looked directly at me. Emily, do you still have the envelope? I immediately knew which one she meant. Yes. Good. She nodded slowly. Keep it safe. I hesitated before asking the question that had been bothering me for months. Why did you give it to me? Margaret studied me for a moment. Then she smiled in a way I had never seen before. There was affection in it. Pride. Perhaps even gratitude. Because one day, she said softly, people are going to learn the difference between value and worth. Before I could ask what she meant, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the hour. Margaret glanced toward the sound and fell silent. Looking back now, I realized she already knew exactly how the story would end. The rest of us were still trying to understand the beginning. Autumn returned almost exactly 1 year after Margaret's birthday celebration, and with it came a quiet sense that something significant was approaching. Margaret's health had stabilized enough for her to remain at home, but nobody could ignore the changes. She moved more slowly. She spent longer periods resting. Most importantly, she seemed determined to put her affairs in order. Attorneys visited the estate frequently. Financial advisors arrived carrying folders and left with signatures. Family members noticed every detail. Speculation spread quickly. During one Sunday dinner, conversations barely concealed their true focus. Relatives discussed trusts, property values, tax strategies, and business succession plans as though Margaret were no longer sitting at the head of the table listening. I watched her carefully that evening. She remained polite, calm, and attentive. Yet there was a sadness in her eyes that had not been there before. It was the look of someone discovering uncomfortable truths about people she loved. A few weeks later, invitations arrived requesting the entire family's presence at the estate for an important meeting. Nobody knew the purpose. Naturally, assumptions spread immediately. By the time the gathering date arrived, some relatives were already discussing possible inheritance outcomes as though decisions had already been announced. The atmosphere inside the estate felt unusually formal that afternoon. Cars filled the driveway. Family members arrived dressed more carefully than necessary. Some carried expressions of concern. Others struggled to hide anticipation. Daniel and I arrived early to help Margaret prepare. When I entered the library, I found her sitting beside the window looking out across the lake. The old leather journal rested beside her. So did several legal folders. She smiled when she saw me. Busy day, I said. Very. Her voice sounded calm. Too calm. I sat beside her. Are you nervous? Margaret considered the question. No. I am curious. About what? She glanced toward the arriving guests outside. About whether people have been paying attention. Before I could ask what she meant, the doorbell rang. Over the next hour, relatives filled the house. Conversations buzzed throughout the hallways. Some discussed family history. Others quietly compared theories. More than once, I noticed people glancing toward Margaret's attorneys, who had arrived carrying several sealed folders. Eventually, everyone gathered in the large living room. The atmosphere became almost electric. Margaret remained seated near the fireplace, while one of the attorneys stood nearby. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Margaret addressed the family. She thanked everyone for coming. She spoke warmly about the family's history, the sacrifices made by previous generations, and the responsibilities that came with privilege. Her words seemed sincere, yet many people appeared impatient. They were waiting for something else. Finally, one relative asked the question directly. Is this about the estate? The room immediately became silent. Margaret smiled faintly. Everything is always about the estate lately, is it not? Nervous laughter followed. Then she surprised everyone. No decisions will be announced today. The disappointment was impossible to miss. Several faces fell instantly. Others exchanged frustrated looks. Margaret continued speaking. There is something more important than assets. Nobody responded. There is something more important than ownership. Still silence. Then she nodded toward her attorney. The attorney stepped forward carrying a sealed package. My heart skipped when I recognized the handwriting on the front. It belonged to Margaret. She looked directly at me. Emily, after today's meeting, I want you to take this. Every head in the room turned toward me. The sudden attention felt overwhelming. Confusion spread immediately. Why would Margaret give me anything in front of everyone? Before anyone could ask, she calmly added, "Do not open it yet." The room grew even quieter. Questions filled every face. Suspicion followed quickly behind them. For the first time, I realized that whatever Margaret had been preparing for all these months was finally beginning to unfold. And judging by the reactions around the room, nobody was ready for what would happen next. The weeks following that gathering changed everything. Not long after the meeting at the estate, Margaret's health declined rapidly. Despite the best efforts of doctors and caregivers, the reality became impossible to avoid. Family members visited frequently. Some came out of genuine love. Others seemed motivated by reasons that were harder to define. Through it all, Margaret remained remarkably calm. During my final visit with her, she held my hand and spoke very little. Yet her eyes carried the same certainty I had seen for months. It was as if she knew exactly how every piece of the story would unfold. A few days later, the Whitmore family gathered once again, this time under far different circumstances. The loss affected everyone. Regardless of disagreements or ambitions, Margaret had been the center of the family for decades. Without her presence, the estate felt strangely empty. Several weeks passed before the attorney scheduled the formal reading of her will. By then, speculation had reached extraordinary levels. Relatives exchanged theories constantly. Some believed the estate would be divided equally. Others expected major portions to go to specific children or grandchildren. Certain family members seemed almost confident about what they would receive. Daniel avoided those conversations whenever possible. I tried to do the same. The day of the reading arrived on a cool autumn afternoon. The attorney's conference room was filled with Whitmore relatives. Every seat was occupied. Conversations stopped the moment the attorney entered carrying a thick folder. My stomach tightened. The envelope Margaret had given me remained unopened in my desk drawer exactly as she instructed. Part of me wondered if it somehow connected to what was about to happen. The attorney began with formal statements before reviewing several charitable gifts and business arrangements. Everything sounded orderly and expected. Then he reached the section everyone had been waiting for: the distribution of the estate. The room became completely silent. Several people leaned forward in anticipation. The attorney adjusted his glasses and continued reading. At first, nobody reacted. Then confusion appeared. He repeated the statement. A second later, disbelief followed. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood what he said. So did everyone else. The attorney calmly looked down at the document and read the provision again. According to Margaret's final will, the entirety of her personal estate, including the primary residence, investment holdings, and controlling interests in several family assets, would pass to a single beneficiary: Emily Carter. My name. The room froze. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence felt unreal. Then heads slowly turned toward me. Shock spread across every face. Some relatives looked confused. Others looked offended. A few simply stared as though they had heard the wrong name. Daniel sat beside me completely speechless. I felt equally stunned. This could not be real. I had never expected anything remotely close to this outcome. I had never asked for it. I had never imagined it. Questions erupted almost immediately. One relative stood up. Another demanded clarification. Several people insisted there had to be a mistake. The attorney remained calm throughout the growing commotion. He confirmed that the will had been reviewed repeatedly and executed properly. There was no error. Margaret's intentions were explicit. As emotions intensified around the room, I barely heard the arguments. My mind kept returning to Margaret's words. People are going to learn the difference between value and worth. Suddenly, the envelope waiting in my desk drawer felt heavier than ever. Then the attorney raised his hand for silence. "There is one final instruction from Mrs. Whitmore," he announced. The room gradually quieted. She requested that Emily open the sealed envelope only after the will has been read. Every eye turned toward me again. My heart pounded. Whatever explanation existed was waiting inside that envelope. And judging by the stunned expressions surrounding me, the truth was about to change far more than an inheritance. The attorney placed the envelope in front of me. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. The room remained silent. Every person present seemed to understand that whatever Margaret wanted to say was waiting inside those pages. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and several photocopied pages from the leather journal I had seen months earlier. I unfolded the letter first. Margaret's familiar handwriting immediately brought a wave of emotion. The attorney asked whether I wished to read it aloud. I hesitated, then nodded. The room listened as I began. If you are hearing these words, then the decision has already been made. I know many of you will be surprised. Some of you may be angry. Others may believe I acted unfairly. That is why I am leaving this explanation. The room remained completely still. I continued reading. For years, I watched this family carefully. I observed how people treated one another when there was nothing to gain. I paid attention to small moments because character is revealed there. Wealth can be inherited. Character cannot. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then I reached the section that changed everything. Margaret explained the purpose of the journal. For nearly 15 years, she had recorded observations about family interactions. Not to judge people, but to understand them. The photocopied pages included examples. One entry described a winter storm during which Emily drove 30 miles through difficult weather to bring groceries and medication without being asked. Another described a hospital visit where Emily stayed for 6 hours while others stopped briefly before leaving. Another recorded family gatherings where Emily quietly cleaned, organized, and helped guests long after everyone else had gone home. The examples continued. None involved money. None involved status. They involved consistency, kindness, reliability. The room grew quieter with every page. Then came Margaret's explanation. Many members of this family love me. I never doubted that. But love alone is not enough to protect a legacy. A legacy survives through stewardship. It survives through service. It survives through people who understand responsibility before reward. I felt my throat tighten as I continued. Emily never treated me as an investment. She never calculated what she might receive. She never positioned herself for advantage. She simply showed up, again and again, when nobody was watching. For the first time since the reading began, nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The letter continued. Margaret explained that the estate was not a reward. It was a responsibility. She believed the assets should remain unified rather than divided into competing interests. More importantly, she believed the person managing them should place people above possessions. Then came the final section. To my family, this decision is not a judgment against you. It is a lesson I hope you will understand someday. True worth is measured by what a person gives, not by what a person owns. If you wish to honor me, support one another. Stop counting what belongs to whom. Start remembering why this family existed in the first place. When I finished reading, silence filled the conference room. The anger that had appeared earlier seemed replaced by something more complicated. Reflection, embarrassment, understanding. Some relatives avoided eye contact. Others stared at the copies of journal pages spread across the table. Daniel reached for my hand. Neither of us spoke. Then the attorney revealed one final instruction. Margaret had established a family legacy trust under Emily's management. Its purpose was to support future generations, preserve family properties, and provide educational opportunities for descendants. Suddenly, the decision made perfect sense. Margaret had never intended to create a winner and losers. She had been trying to protect the family from itself. As everyone slowly absorbed the truth, I realized the inheritance was never the real story. The real story was why Margaret believed one ordinary daughter-in-law could be trusted with something far more valuable than money. The months that followed were not easy. Although Margaret's letter answered many questions, emotions do not disappear simply because the truth has been explained. Some family members needed time to process what had happened. Others struggled to accept it. A few avoided speaking to me altogether for several weeks. I understood their feelings. If our positions had been reversed, I might have felt confused too. The difference was that I never viewed the inheritance as a victory. Every time I walked through the Whitmore estate, I remembered Margaret's words. The estate was not a reward. It was a responsibility. That understanding shaped every decision I made. One of my first actions was to gather the family together. Many relatives arrived expecting legal discussions or financial announcements. Instead, I placed copies of Margaret's final letter at every seat. Once everyone settled into the room, I spoke honestly. Nothing Margaret built belongs to one person alone, I said. She trusted me to protect it, not to control it. The atmosphere remained cautious. Some people listened quietly. Others appeared skeptical. Then I presented the plan Margaret's trust had authorized. Family properties would remain preserved rather than divided and sold. Educational funds would be available to future generations. Annual family meetings would continue. Historical records and photographs would be archived so future descendants could understand where they came from. Slowly, the tension in the room began to ease. People started asking questions. Productive conversations replaced suspicion. For the first time in a long while, the family seemed focused on something larger than individual interests. Several months later, Daniel and I stood beside the lake behind the estate watching grandchildren play near the shore. The property looked exactly as Margaret would have wanted. Full of life, full of family, full of possibility. I thought about the birthday party from more than a year earlier. The small table in the back of the room. The comments. The assumptions people made about my worth because of my background. None of those moments seemed important anymore. Margaret had understood something that many people spend their entire lives learning. A person's value cannot be measured by income, status, possessions, or influence. Real value appears in everyday choices. It appears in loyalty, in service, in kindness offered without expectation of reward. One afternoon, nearly a year after the will was read, I returned to the library and opened Margaret's journal again. The final entry had been written only weeks before her passing. I had never noticed it before. The words were simple. The greatest inheritance is not wealth. It is character passed from one generation to the next. I sat quietly for a long time after reading that sentence. Then I closed the journal and placed it beside a framed photograph of Margaret. Through the window, sunlight reflected across the lake just as it had during so many conversations we shared. For a moment, it almost felt as though she were still there, watching, observing, smiling. The family never became perfect. No family ever does. There were still disagreements, different opinions, occasional misunderstandings. But something important had changed. The competition that once threatened to divide everyone gradually gave way to cooperation. People began showing up for one another again, not because they expected something in return, because they finally understood what Margaret had spent years trying to teach them. As for me, I remained exactly who I had always been. The same daughter-in-law who carried groceries, drove to appointments, helped clean after gatherings, and stayed when others left. The inheritance never changed my identity. If anything, it reminded me why Margaret made her decision. In the end, the most surprising part of the story was not that one ordinary daughter-in-law inherited an extraordinary estate. The most surprising part was discovering that the woman everyone underestimated had already possessed the one quality Margaret valued above everything else. And because of that lesson, the legacy she left behind became far greater than money. It became a family that finally remembered what truly mattered.